It is finally time to talk about transitions, from MagnatesMedia style transitions to ink mats and film burns. Like, I use a whole bunch. There are a lot of different ways to use transitions, and it can be even harder to decide when to use what type of transitions. Some of the transitions we will be looking at today can be done natively in After Effects with the tools they have in there. Some do require a little bit of overlay stock footage, but luckily we have today's video sponsor Softbox to help us out with that. In After Effects, I have 5 different composition setups, but we're really looking at 4 different type of transitions, but one of them just has a little bit of a subcategory. But the first one we're going to be taking a look at is the renowned MagnatesMedia style transition. I'd like to classify this as a bit of a panning transition with a foreground element to cover up the cut point, and that is the major thing you want to focus on in using these type of transitions is if it makes sense, because you do need a bit of depth for this to work really well, because if you just have a flat scene, it's not going to sell the effect as well. In here, I have a little composition setup where I have 2 scenes that cut right in the middle, and in this composition itself, if you are interested in the project file that we're going to be working in today, you can get it on Patreon. Essentially, it's just a little bit of a camera move here, as you can see, and then we have the car just kind of moving. Super simple, nothing too crazy. I've just added a little bit of depth in the layers just so we get that tiny bit of parallax as it moves. But the way we are going to transition between these 2 scenes is very simple. If we start with our actual animation of the scene, we can go forward to, let's say, 1 second, and then we can just use, since the composition fills up the whole thing, we can just go over to the right, and I will say I've just scaled this up a little bit to fit the scenes in there because they're not 1920 by 1080, double that next to each other. What you do here is just create a keyframe with it wherever you want. Go forward a little bit, let's say we go forward 1 second, and then in this case we're just going to move all the way over to the left side, and then we have a little pan transition here, and I do have motion blur enabled just because it seems to fit the style. But then you can add some easing to it if you hit F9 for the keyframes, and then you can just maybe ease these in a little bit so that on both sides we just get a little bit of pacing in there like that. And then it's super simple. All you need is a foreground element. So in this case, I have this tree here. If I open that up, you can see it's just a very simple tree each side, and I've just cut out like the middle of it. You want to make sure that it kind of makes sense for the scene. So we have this nature scene, which is why I picked it, because it kind of fits with that. So all you really want to do in this case, since we have all our animations in this one pre-comp, you just want to take this and you just want to parent it to the artboard. You want to make sure you parent it in a position where it makes sense. So right here you can see the tree is right in the middle of our animation, which is exactly where we want the cut point to be. So we're just going to link that, and then that will animate it with it. But you can see the scale is a little bit off because the trees aren't big enough. So if you go forward, let's say right here where it's in the middle, you can scale that up until it kind of fits. You can place it wherever you kind of want until you hide that cut point pretty well. And then just make sure that you get a nice little seamless transition here. And that is pretty much all that goes into a very simple whip pan type thing. And of course, last bit of detail, motion blur to really help it. You might have to play with the position and scale of it just a little bit to get that exact point where you want it. And it's really as simple as that. Super efficient in scenes where you have a bit of depth like this one, or even in real world footage where you might see it in movies and ads and whatnot, where you see a little person walking by the front of the camera to match a transition between one and another scene. Now the second type of transition is using ink mats and brush strokes. And these type of transitions work really well for like more historical pieces or creative pieces because they kind of resemble that type of thing. So with historical pieces, they would often write with fountain pens or ink. So that's why that style really makes sense for that type of material rather than a MagnatesMedia style that's a little bit more refined and digital. And the same with the brush strokes. If you're making a video about something creative like painting, it just makes sense to use brush strokes because it's within that realm. Now we're going to be doing 2 types of transitions. One is revealing elements, kind of like you'd see in Ghost of Tsushima, stuff like that, where they use these overlay elements to reveal certain characters or figures or text. And the second type is a full screen type of transition that you can use to transition from one thing to another thing. Let's first open up this little composition I have set up here, which is super simple. It's just this high quality image asset from Softbox, and then I have a couple more assets layered in there. So I have a photo, and I have an illustration of a church or something, and then a map as well. Again, all of these assets are from Softbox, today's video sponsor, so thank you to them. They offer unlimited downloads of diverse and high quality assets at one set subscription price. Softbox's stock library includes everything you need to create high quality videos, from stock footage like we're gonna be using today to illustrations, photos, overlays, templates, pretty much anything you can think of. And for all my fellow DaVinci Resolve editors, Softbox now has you covered with customizable DaVinci Resolve templates, which let you create create higher quality videos faster and easier than before. If you work in After Effects or Premiere Pro, they also do have a Creative Cloud plugin, which is super helpful since it lets you access their whole library from within the application itself. And we will definitely be taking advantage of that in today's video. It's just such a huge time saver not having to leave the app to go and find whatever you need for your project. Last but not least, I always stress this one because it's so important. Storyblocks has you covered with clear-cut licensing and coverage, and that means that you can focus 100% of your energy on just being creative and not having to worry about your legal rights. Anything you download from Storyblocks is 100% royalty free, and you are covered in perpetuity to the highest level of legal coverage in the industry. So to get started with unlimited stock media downloads at one set price, head to storyblocks.com/Mapal or hit the link in the description. But without further ado, let's hop straight back into the tutorial where I have a bunch of these assets that I've gotten from Storyblocks, and we want to review some of these elements very elegantly by using some of these overlay assets, more specifically ink mats. And I've found a couple, and the main thing you want to think about when using ink mats is how thick or rich it is. So you have very dark elements which will reveal 100% of the image, and then you have those little feathered areas which will reveal less. So the brighter it is, the less it will reveal. So you need, of course, the main bit to be pretty dark, but you also want some of that nice feathering to get some of that look that you really want in these type of transitions, just to make it look super smooth and elegant. You also want to pay attention to where the ink drops and how many ink blots you have and what kind of coverage you have, like this one where you have it first in the middle and then you have an additional one out on the side, which can just look super elegant and a super sick way to review a little bit more and just keep it interesting throughout, so it's not one solid motion. But let's drag this first one in and use it for this image up here, and we will take this one and place it right above our world map, and I will take the pick whip right here from the world map and I'll drag it onto the ink drops. And the standard feature of this is using the alpha, so whether it's transparent or not, to decide where to show what, but we are going to change it to be a luma matte, so it's going to take black or white values. And you can see right now, because most of the image is grayish, it's just going to show just a little bit, and we can invert that so that we see that the darker it is, the more it's going to show. So if I drag this out to the left a little bit, you can see in the areas where it's white, it's going to show less. And that is typically what you want to use with these, unless you of course have an inverted ink mat. So if we play that back, you can see it's going to reveal, it's going to use that ink mat to drive the transition, and it's going to look super smooth. And I think this looks pretty good. We might drag it up just a little bit earlier, just so it doesn't take that long for it to start, because we do want it to come in a little bit before the circle comes in. Just drag it a little bit to match the pacing of it. And you can see it just looks super nice, just having that flow in and a little bit of that gray area that is going to fade it in ever so slowly. You can see I also have a little bit of texture on the edges, and that is just using a rough and edges effect just to get that little bit of more artistic look almost. And that is pretty much all that goes into this technique, and you can just do it again and again. But let's have a look at the Creative Cloud plugin from Storyblocks because it's super useful. So if you go into Windows and go to extensions, and then you can go into the Storyblocks, you do want to make sure you of course have this downloaded. But essentially it's going to pop up this little window, and once you're logged in, you can search for pretty much anything. But if you go into video and then type ink mat, which is what we need in this case, you can see it brings up pretty much anything you need. We can even preview them right in the app, and there's definitely not a lack of options in here, and we can pick pretty much whatever we want. So let's take this one for example, and we'll just hit download, and you get options what you want to download. Typically I like to use the high res one just because it's better to play with, and you'll just confirm where you want it to download to, and just like that you can see it's downloading straight onto your computer without even having to leave Adobe After Effects, which is awesome. Super great in a pinch. If you need something, you can just drag it from your downloads folder wherever you download it to and put it right in your composition. I'm going to scale this one up, and I'm going to use this for our little castle down here, whatever this thing is. And you just want to make sure that you of course scale it to fit so that it covers the whole thing. And same thing as before, you want to drag it on top of it. So in this case, it's right here. And we want to do the same technique as before. We want to use the track mat and just enable that. Want to make sure you have it set to luma matte and then invert it in this case, and move this forward to match right at the beginning so that as the line comes in, it kind of gets revealed. So maybe even move this up a little bit more until about right here, so that we get a little bit of that fading in as it slowly comes in. And that is pretty much all that goes into this kind of technique. It's just using it to reveal individual elements instead of a whole scene. But we can also go in and actually transition between full scenes using either the same technique or something like brushstrokes. In this case, let's do some brushstrokes just because it's super fun to work with and super easy. So you can use assets again from Storyblocks. I'm just going to drag in a couple of these files, which are EPS files, essentially just vector files, so they're going to be super high res. You can just drag them into your composition. Let's pick 3 of them. And you want to make sure you turn on the collapse transformations or continuously rasterize, which just means we can scale them up to be however big we need to without losing any quality. And let's hide these first 2. And this one has 2 inside of it. So we are just going to create a mask using our shape tool up here. And let's use this top one as our brush here. And we're just going to scale this up a bit more until it fits, let's say, most of the screen right here. And super easy, you can either just animate the position of it by hitting P and just make sure it covers the full screen, and then set a keyframe, go back a little bit and take it off the screen. And then you have a transition where it kind of comes in, and you can redo that with every single one of these. So if you scale this one up and again, hit P and to bring up the position, and this time maybe do it the opposite way just to get a little bit of visual variance in there. And last but not least, the same with the last one here. Scale that up and set a keyframe for the position, and then go back and drag it out to the left. Let's add a little bit of sexy speed to this, and now we have a transition that looks kind of like this. You can even offset these just a little bit, just to make it look a little bit more interesting. And then you can take these and pre-compose them by hitting Shift-Command-C and name this Brush Pre. And for this layer, let's use the track matte here to link it to the brush. And just like that, we now have a little bit of transition, and you can just invert that so that the black actually removes it, and drag these out a little bit. And now we have a transition using brush strokes. A quick tip, if it doesn't cover the full screen, once it covers the full thing, kind of like right here, super easy thing to do is just add a black background here to match it, and then just trim it right to be right here. So it comes in and covers up. And you might even play with the opacity a little bit just to get the timing of it completely right. Otherwise, you can just add more brush strokes to it. Now, the second way, we don't actually need any position keyframes. So if you hit U to bring up the keyframes, you can unlink or unclick the stopwatch thing to remove that, and just maybe scale it down to fit right above in the screen right here. That looks pretty good. And then we are going to use a stroke element here. So I'm going to click my stroke, and I'm just going to click and drag. We can always move it up a little bit to fully cover, and we're going to remove the fill of this. And then we are gonna put on a stroke. Let's put it to white, and then increase it to cover the whole shape here. And that is the main thing that we want to keep in mind here, is we want the whole shape to be covered. And then we can add a roughen edges to this. Let's solo that up. And now we want to create a brush-like texture. Before that, I'm actually gonna open this up, and I'm gonna add a trim paths, just so I can see the edges, because that's our main focus point here, is we want to see the edges. So if I put it to about 55%, I can see it. And then we want to play with the complexity. Let's take that up so we get some nice roughening in there. Take the sharpness down to something like 0.5. And then the stretch, let's stretch it out a little bit to make it look a little bit more like a stroke. Increase the border a whole bunch. You can see we kind of get something that looks like a brush stroke. And again, you can use this alone as a brush stroke as well if you want to, but I like to use it as like a reveal type of thing. Play around with the brush stroke and the stretch until you get something that looks pretty cool. Something you think could look like a brush stroke. The cool thing about the roughen edges is it just works off a turbulent display, so it makes it super easy to work with, and it's not very render intensive. But now we can take the trim paths, and let's set the end to 0, depending on which way you want it to go, of course, and go forward about a second, and then set it to 100. And now we have an animation that looks kind of like this, where you have a little bit of that brush stroke coming in. You can see it just gives it a little bit of variance at the end, which also looks really cool. Hit U to just show those keyframes, unsolo that, and then we can use that as a track matte for our actual brush. So if we show that, and now we just get a little bit of an animation like a brush stroke that is coming on without having to animate that itself. And that just looks super cool as well. So maybe add a little bit of easing to this. Again, sexy speed, keep it nice and easy. And once you've done that, let's say with a full screen, you could pre-comp it, name a brush pre, this time 2, because we already have 1, and then use that as a track matte. Just link that to that. And just like that, you have a little bit of transition here that just looks super sexy and saucy. You can layer this up, do a couple different layers of it, just make it look really, really nice. Now this next transition is super fun, and I've seen Cole Bennett use it a lot in his music videos. It also works in animation. You can do pretty much the same thing, but I thought it would be fun to do a real world example just because I think that's where it looks the best. Essentially what you want to do here is a match cut, and the main thing here is having an element that is the same. Super powerful technique. And all I'm gonna do is open up my grid so I know where the exact center is, and then I'm gonna drag this to have the ball in the center, and you can play with the scale of everything until you get a look that kind of works for you. Let's just set it back to 100, and that is right about in the middle. And then we'll have another layer in here and move the ball over so that it is right in the middle. And you can hold Shift T while scale is open to bring up the opacity, and then just decrease it a little bit, and you can match it to be around the same size. It doesn't need to be perfect, but usually the closer you can get to the same size, the better it kind of looks. So just keep that in mind, just to get the shape and the position as close as possible as you can. Increase that opacity back up. And then again, another one, let's take a golf ball, S, and then Shift T to open up the opacity. We'll scale that down until that golf ball is about the same size. And then it's just rinse and repeat. And the more layers you have, the better it's gonna look. If you only have 1 or 2, it's gonna look a bit iffy, but if you have a good few, like we have this stack right here, it's gonna look super sick, especially when you cut really fast between them. You can do the same with text, pretty much any type of animation. You can do it with faces. I just really like these pictures of the dog and the cat using the balls, so that's why I wanted to do this with real world footage. Now, it's super easy for us to get this to look something pretty cool. We're just gonna take all of these and maybe go 3 frames forward. You can do faster as well, and just Shift Command D to delete all those layers. Or, as I've learned recently, you can hold Option and close bracket to trim the layers. And then you just want to position them one by one. You can select all of them, right click, and then go to Keyframe Assistant, and then Sequence Layers, and that'll automatically sequence those. So now you have a composition. If I mark the end of this, that looks kind of like this. And as you can see, the ball being in that same position just looks super cool. And it doesn't even matter that it's not filling up the whole screen, but this is a super cool base look, and then you can play around with that even more. So let's say you took all of these layers, pre-comp them, and just name this Match Cut Pre, and then hit S and P and R to bring up the position, scale, and rotation. And then what you want to do, for example, let's zoom in here right at the beginning, scale that all the way up, and keyframe the rotation and the scale, and go all the way to the end, set the rotation to 1 maybe, and then scale out a little bit until that covers the full screen. You can even go in, let's add some easing to it, and then you can add some motion blur, and that'll just spice it up a little bit more. Just looks super cool. Just a nice little effect if you have a lot of different material to work with. You can do the same with text, whatever, as I mentioned. Just a super neat little transition you can use. And I definitely want to play around more with this because it's super fun to use. The last transition, which I use in all my videos, I get so many requests about sharing what I use and all that stuff, and that is film burns and using that as transitions. I like it because it has a lot of texture and I feel like it fits my style in terms of the look that I'm going for. Essentially here I have a little composition set up with some footage that I found on Softbox, and that's just gonna give us something we can use to show the transitions. When I use film burns, there are a lot of things I think about, like the sound design. I also think about the pacing, the colors, the coverage. No matter what, those things are important to think about for these type of transitions, but especially with film burns, I want to make sure that they feel and look right. And sometimes you can choose the right blending mode or the wrong blending mode, and then the transition is not going to work as well. Sometimes it even works not using a blending mode at all. But I have a couple of different effects or a couple of different overlays that I want to share that I think look real cool. I'm just going to start by dragging in the first one in here and just placing it right at the top will work. And this one is just, it has some nice borders and it has a couple of flicks in here, and it just looks super cool really. Just a nice little transition here. And we don't need too much of it. I'm just gonna scale it down to fit. Then let's have a point here. So it goes from this, I think I wanna start it, and then I wanna go a couple frames forward until it switches. It goes back to that, like that, and just trim that up and place it right in between. And then the easiest way of doing this, if you wanna see what everything looks like, is just cycling through the blend modes until you get something that looks super cool. And the easiest way to cycle through the blend modes is just holding Shift and then plus or minus to cycle through them. And you just want to look for something that gives you pretty good coverage and looks pretty cool. Most of the time I use Add just because it looks very cool with these kind of orangey colors and just gives you a little bit of that flick. But as you can see, you get a little bit of that in the beginning where it has that very bright color, and that can look very cool to sell the transition of it being very fast. And sometimes what I like to do is actually speed up these type of transitions. So if you go into time and then time stretch, and just speed it up a little bit, maybe say 50%, just half the pace of it, and then just mark it right in the middle and link that up. And that's just gonna help sell the effect a little bit more because it's a little bit more snappy and it gives you that effect that it's like flashing. The second one here is a little bit different. It is like an overlay kind of sequence where they have a lot of these cutting elements. And for these type of things, I actually don't use any blending mode, but I do wanna make sure that I pick a part that is very hectic, has a lot of different elements. So let's say right here, if I start it right here, and then go a couple frames forward like that, trim that up, and then I'll just place it as an overlay element without changing the blending mode or anything. But the most important part here is just making sure that it is fast. If this is slow, it's not gonna work and it's not gonna look cool. So pacing is super important with these type of elements because you need that pace in there to really sell the effect. And that's the biggest thing I see with a lot, is that it's just too slow. And when it's too slow, it looks bad. Let's try one of these, which is a little bit different, just because it's a bit softer, it doesn't have as much coverage, but it can be a really cool overlay element to add into the video. So again, change it to something like an ad to get some of those colors. You can even do a lighten depending on the look that you're kind of going for. Screen works as well. It just depends on like the intensity and how it reads it. So in this case, let's say that looks pretty good. And then I just want a couple of these elements where it just kind of flares over. So I'm just gonna cut right there, cut it right there as well. And this will just be like overlay feel. I won't necessarily use it as transition just because it's not gonna work very well as a transition because it doesn't have the coverage for it. But you can use it as like a before transition to build it up a little bit. So it's kind of like a warm-up piece to get into the mood of it. And that can be super important as well as creating just a little bit of that anticipation. But let's take this next one, which is just a different type of overlay as well. It just has a lot of really nice flicks, which looks super cool. And a lot of these in different corners, just a great example of a really good overlay texture that you can use over and over and over again, and you can cut it up into smaller segments, and then you can duplicate it and go to a different part of it and use it again because it has so many really good segments. But again, just looks super cool, and you get some really cool texture in there as well. This one still a little bit slow, so time stretch, and it's just like something like 50. Just speed it up a little bit. 10, 12 frames are usually pretty good for a transition. Just creates a little bit of that, and then the texture in there is so sick, works beautifully. But that is pretty much it for the 5 types of transitions that I use and love a lot. I think they're super useful and they all have their place. The MagnatesMedia one, probably a lot of you are familiar with using that to transition in between scenes. You can also use it in real world footage. Remember that all of these you can use in real world footage as well, not just animations. All of them are also fairly simple to do in something like Premiere Pro or DaVinci Resolve if you have some basic knowledge of keyframing. Most importantly, I really want to get this across is that you have to keep in mind the style of the project. Using film burns in something like a regular 2D animation is not going to look super good because it doesn't make sense. Using ink mats in a real world footage that's super slow is not going to look good because it's not going to make sense. So keep that in mind as well when you pick what type of transitions that you want to use for your project, and then try to keep it somewhat consistent across. But with that being said, I just want to say thank you for watching along. Hopefully you learned something new. Hopefully you got a little bit of a better idea of when and how to use different transitions. And of course, if you do want access to this project file, it will be available on my Patreon at patreon.com/Mapal, or click the link in the description to get there. And yeah, comment, like, subscribe. Peace out. Sayonara.